Thank you, Woody. Thank you to Slow Money. I realize today is Remembrance Day. It's called Veterans Day here, and we saw the armored tanks go by. But Remembrance Day is about the end of the First World War. It's meant to be about peace. My heart is with the survivors of the Bhopal tragedy 30 years ago, who are fasting right now in Delhi because till today, 30 years later, they don't have justice. And they're fasting without water. It was 30 years ago with the tragedy of Bhopal, which took immediately about 3,000 lives because of the leak of a pesticide plant owned then by Union Carbide. Now it's owned by Dow Chemicals. And what connects the fasting of the Bhopal survivors in Delhi to the fate of agriculture in this country is that Dow Chemicals now is trying to bring genetically engineered crops resistant to 2,4-D, which was an ingredient of Agent Orange. Now, I started to look at agriculture in 1984 because of the tragedy of Bhopal and the tragedy of Punjab. When you join the two tragedies, we are talking about 12 9/11s. That's the number of people who died. And I was forced to sit up and ask, why has agriculture become like war? Why is it so violent? And I did my book, and I did my research, and wrote the book for the United Nations University called The Violence of the Green Revolution. I won't go into too much detail because right here from the University of Kentucky Press, you're going to be having a reader available soon, and the flyers are outside at the bookstore. So the details you can follow. Now, the story of the Green Revolution was this, that chemicals and miracle seeds, that's what it was called, chemicals and miracle seeds, would create so much prosperity that we'd never have a peasant rebellion again. And prosperity to peace, Green Revolution got a Nobel Peace Prize. When I started to look at it in '84, Punjab was not a land of peace. It had become a land of war. And I realized as I went deeper into it, it was a land of war because the instruments of industrial agriculture come from the wars. I'm reading on my trip, it's a very heavy book, not good reading. It's called Hell's Cartel. You remember the Nuremberg trials? You remember I.G. Farben? That was the beginnings of the chemical companies that became the agrichemical companies that now have become the seed corporations. And that's a continuity we forget. So on this Remembrance Day, not only do I want to remember the tragedies that we have faced, tragedies of war, but the continuing tragedy of war in our food system and the imperative to create a non-violent, compassionate system of farming. The word in Sanskrit for non-violence is ahimsa. Himsa is violence. The absence of ahimsa is non-violence. And what I have learned in these 30 years is that the militarized mind that gave us war chemicals continues to guide the shaping of our agriculture and food. It is war through another name. And because it's based on these external inputs, the agrichemicals, seeds that have to be purchased, the GMO seeds, the non-renewable seeds, it can only survive as a monoculture. And a little later, after 1984, at a meeting in 1987, I was woken up to the fact that the old chemical companies were now bringing us GMOs largely to own and patent life and own and patent seed to collect royalties from seed. That those monocultures are now becoming elements of monopoly control over life itself and therefore over the food system. Our challenge is to create systems that are at peace with the earth and at peace with our bodies, because at the end of it, food is what nourishes us or should be nourishing us. Today, food has become the single biggest threat to both the planet as well as our health. We're repeatedly told we need those pesticides, we need those chemical fertilizers, we need the GMOs for feeding the world. 9 billion people can't feed them without these technologies. The reality is, in spite of a century in the West and half a century in my country, industrial chemical agriculture has actually increased hunger in the world. It has increased malnutrition in the world. It has not solved the problem. This is the year of family farming for the United Nations. And the figures that have come out this year are that 30% of the food is all we get from the industrial large-scale system. 70% comes from small farms. And the FAO was not counting gardens. If you add gardens to the small farms, we would reach an 80% figure. And as was the discussion earlier in the GMO session, from 80%, we can reach 100% very, very easily. Only 30% of the food is coming from an agriculture system that is engaged in war against the earth. 75% of the biodiversity in agriculture has been driven out by monocultures. Look at what's happened to pollinators. The UNEP assessment on ecological services of pollinators shows $169 billion of contribution by pollinators, which are being killed. 75% of the water abuse is for industrial farming. When I did the study on Punjab, I realized 10 times more water was being used to produce the same amount of food. And it isn't just the water that's being exploited. Punjab will be out of water by 2020. The rivers are dying, and the groundwater is now at about 1,000 feet below. But this water loaded with chemicals is then running into waterways, into lakes, into oceans, creating dead zones. And the air that we breathe, 40% of all greenhouse gases are coming from an industrial globalized system of agriculture. And that's the reason I wrote my book, Soil Not Oil, that in the soil is not just the solution to absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but in the soil is the alternative to grow food in ways that we don't have to harm the earth, we don't have to kill the microorganisms, we don't have to kill the pollinators, we don't have to kill ourselves. The violence against our bodies, the first violence is that we are not producing food. What's being produced is commodities. Commodities don't feed people. Most of the corn and soya of this country is going for animal feed and biofuel. Now, if we listened to the cows and the bovine, they would be telling us, I want grass, I'm a herbivore. Herbivore means grass, herbs. They didn't vote for intensive feed from GMO soybean or GMO corn. the combination of diverting so much land to commodity production and so much commodity to non-food use is one part of the problem. 10% is all that of the corn and soya that goes directly for human eating. And I would imagine if you manage to get your labeling laws in place, even that 10% will disappear. Today, 1 billion people are hungry, permanently. Hunger was always localized in space and time. You had a bad drought, you might have hunger that year. Next year, the rain came, you had food. And even with a drought, in India, we've had traditional systems that ensured that in bad years, you'd still have food. The most intensively inhabited desert of the world is the region of Rajasthan, the desert state of India, in the northwest. Beautiful state. In Rajasthan, because they're a desert, because they know there'll be rainfall failure, there are villages that stock food grain as a commons for 5 years so that you won't have hunger. People will be fed. Today we have 1 billion people hungry because it is not linked to 1 year's drought or a localized war. It is linked to the structural design of an industrial food system. My book, Making Peace with the Earth, has a very long section of hunger by design. And I have watched how in regions where tribals are growing rice, they can't eat the rice because they've borrowed for the chemicals that go into the rice, and they've got to sell the rice they grow to pay for the debt. This is why, globally, of the 1 billion people who are hungry, half of them are farmers and producers of food who are not able to eat what they grow because of the chemical treadmill and with it the debt treadmill. In India, 250 million hungry, half of them are farmers. A system of capital-intensive, chemical-intensive, fossil fuel-intensive agriculture must create a debt trap. And a debt trap leads to hunger at individual level, household level, and as well as national levels. There was a lot of discussion this morning about cheap food. In the third world, there's nothing like cheap food, because the global market has been taken over by the agribusiness, the Cargills of the world, who introduced into the World Trade Organization the agricultural agreement. I call it the Cargill Agreement. And the Cargill Agreement, in effect, has led to huge dumping with subsidies in the third world. The rich country subsidy is $400 billion per year. That's more than $1 billion a day. And with this dumping, hunger grows because people can't grow food. The market's taken over with this artificially cheap entry, which is then speculated on, and that is the key. I don't know how many of you followed that what was called the Arab Spring actually began as food riots in Egypt. The first marches of the people were holding bread because of the speculation. After the 2000 collapse of Wall Street, investors moved into food. And there were advertisements saying, don't you like rising prices? It's good for investors to have rising prices. But for the poor who are eating 1 meal a day, rising prices means they eat a half meal a day. And Syria, which is at the heart of the media obsession of this country, as recently as 2009, the issue in Syria was a severe drought. And because the seed supply system has changed over time, farmers are not allowed to use drought-tolerant seeds that they have evolved and bred. They get seeds which require chemicals. That's what the Green Revolution was about. So the drought meant very, very severe failure of crops. 75% crop failure, 85% livestock death. 800,000 people moved from villages into the city of Dara and started to protest. But Assad had commitments to the globalized trade system, not to looking after his farmers. And he started to throw the peasants into jail, just as much as the farmers of Punjab were thrown into jail in those days, which then led to the eruption of violence. We've seen after that what happened. The rebels organize against Assad. Sadly, the US, which thinks it knows what it's doing, finance the rebels. Out of it, you got an ISIS. And now there's no idea about what to do. When I watch what's going on in Syria, I think of the same logic of militarized violence that is taking place in the fields. Without diversity of insects, many of which are pollinators, many of which are friendly insects, like spiders and ladybird beetles, which control pests, industrial agriculture sees every insect as an enemy to be exterminated. Bring the spray guns. Every plant that grows, and I've done studies, 250 species of volunteer crops that grow on their own in ecological fields in India and bring us the nutrition we need. But everything that grows on its own, enemy to be exterminated with herbicide. So much of what has spread worldwide as organic farming was started with Sir Albert Howard being sent to India in 1905 to improve Indian agriculture. And as he says in his book, The Agricultural Testament, I arrived, I saw no pests in the fields were fertile, I threw away my spray gun and decided to turn the pest and the peasant into my teachers. That's the humility of a real scientist. As a result of his studies, he then wrote the Agricultural Testament. He also started detailed studies on soils, wrote the book Soil and Health, which is also published by the Kentucky University Press, and told us that health is one grand continuum, from the soil to the plant to the humans. Next year is going to be the year of soil, and I'm committed to doing a pilgrimage to Indore, where Howard went to develop the composting system, which he called the Indore process. And I hope some of you will join us on this pilgrimage. It'll be in the first week of October. On the 1st of October, we celebrate a festival for the earth. And next year, of course, we'll celebrate the soil, the living soil. In industrial agriculture, by the way, the soil is defined as an empty container, which has only two functions: to hold the plant and to hold the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Because industrial agriculture had no idea about the richness of the soil organisms. Now, not only is the soil living, seeds are living. I've been reading that all morning. A tomato seeds makes even the highest flyers seem paltry. There's a family of crops which I absolutely love, and we've promoted them as forgotten foods, the family of millets, which you think is bird food, but it is the most nutritious human food. Now, the reason the 7 species of millets are called millets is because each seed gives 1 million seeds. It's from the million that you get the word millet. For the same amount of water, you can grow 400 times more nutrition. I weaned my son on finger millet, which has so much calcium, so much iron, that you can never have deficiency. And that's the issue, that biodiversity and seeds of biodiversity are the source of food and nutrition. They are the source of doing pest control without us having to spray poisons. A good field with good cover crops, a mixture, will never have weeds. And the few weeds that come will usually be useful either for animals or humans as animals. You know, my favorite are amaranth and chenopodium. We've grown up on this. And on our farm, I'm so happy to see the Navdanya farm in Doon Valley. Now they have plants that I haven't seen since childhood. There's a PhD student doing studies on pollinators, and she counted 6 times more pollinators on the farm than in the forest next door. Which also tells us that when we do compassionate farming for love for the earth and all her species, we actually create sanctuaries for all life. One sanctuary is under the soil, which we don't see, but it's the basis of our survival. And you know, the last book that Darwin wrote was on what he called the earthworm. He called it the mold. And he wrote this book and said, when human history will be written, it will be recognized that the earthworm plays the biggest role in human survival. And soils rich in earthworms have much higher nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium than any amount you can put from outside. And they are aerating the soil. They are the soil builders. They are creating a water reservoir. They are the alternative to the fertilizer factory. And yet, what we are doing is throwing chemicals and toxics and killing the soil. The chemical industry that came out of the war, starting from 1980s onwards, realized that they could appropriate the tools of recombinant DNA and apply them to farming. And I was at this meeting in '87, and they were very honest. They said, the reason we have to do genetic engineering of seeds and crops is it's the only way we can take a patent. A patent is an exclusive right for an invention that prevents the inventor from making, using, selling, distributing whatever is patented. When it comes to machines like this mic, yes, whoever made it would either have had a license from the original patent holder or have a patent themselves. But life and seeds are not inventions. Seeds evolve. They're a continuity of evolution. I'm so grateful to Pope Francis, who said, evolution is real. And in every little seed is millions of years of evolution of the earth. In the tiniest of seeds is thousands of years of cultural evolution and human intelligence that's gone into breeding. 99.9% breeding has been done by farmers. Now, the varieties farmers have bred, and they've been bred further by public scientists, public breeders, they're being appropriated. And it's a very clever way of appropriation. Basically, you shoot a toxic gene through recombinant DNA with a gene gun, and now you claim the evolutionary potential of that plant as your manufacture. There's a very tragic decision of the Supreme Court of this country last year, Baumann versus Monsanto, where a farmer buys soybean in an elevator, and the Supreme Court rules that no matter how far down the line the grain is, it's the manufacture and property of Monsanto. Now, Monsanto wrote the intellectual property rights laws of WTO. Their representative, James Enyart, admitted in a 1995 meeting in Washington, D.C., we were the patient, physician, and diagnostician all in one. We wrote a treaty, gave it to our government, which then took it to the world. 1999, this treaty, which is on patenting of life, was to be reviewed. Statutory, mandatory review in the WTO. My government and many governments said patenting of life has too many implications, not be allowed. And biopiracy, the stealing of biodiversity as well as traditional knowledge, should be treated as an international crime. Not only has that review not been done, There is now an attempt, our Prime Minister came recently, and President Obama, they signed an agreement, basically driven by corporations, to prevent any farmers' rights in India, or to prevent us from making generic medicine, which costs about 100 times less. I have an idea about this, and I'll come back to it towards the end. So we've got, since the patenting started, and GMOs were introduced to do patenting, what do we have? We've got 4 crops: corn, canola, soya, cotton. That accounts for most planting. In my country, only cotton, BT cotton, exists. Monsanto came in illegally. I had to sue them. Eventually, they got their approvals. Today, Monsanto controls 95% of the cotton seed supply in India. The seed cost jumped 17,000%. It used to be 5 rupees before globalization, and Monsanto sold seeds at 3,700 rupees a kilo. And because it doesn't really work, neither is the herbicide tolerance working to control weeds, nor is the BT toxin working to control pests. Farmers are having to use more pesticides in India, more herbicides, and more Roundup here. So what does Monsanto do? Add a second gene for the toxic. Most evolution requires multi-genetic concerts. That's what breeding is about. For whole systems to evolve together. Rice with rice, wheat with wheat. The single gene transfer that has been achieved through genetic engineering can only express single traits, and these are toxic traits. Yield doesn't come from single gene transfer, it comes from the whole plant. Drought tolerance doesn't come from single gene transfer, it's in the evolution of the plant. So basically, now they're adding 2 genes. I think in the US you have 8 stacks. 8 genes are added, they are still single gene expressions of BT and HT. And it reminds me of Einstein saying, a clear sign of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and again, expecting a different outcome. If 1 gene evolved resistance in the pest, 2 genes will evolve faster resistance. If 1 gene evolved resistance in the weed, then 5 genes is going to create weeds that are absolutely uncontrollable. Of course, they're now coming out with stories about golden rice and GMO banana. The golden rice is hundreds of % inferior to the biodiversity we can be growing if we weren't spraying that biodiversity with herbicides to kill it. If we want enough vitamin A and enough iron, we need biodiversity to flourish. We need every small farmer to be able to grow diversity and through it grow nutrition. We need gardens in every school and in every community. Because growing of commodities is not what's going to solve the food crisis we face, we decided to start assessing the nutrition per acre on our farms. Because after all, food is for nutrition. And the report we produce called Health Per Acre, I'll just run through the summaries, because if I go through every farm, we'll be way past the time. In terms of protein, organic mixed farming, 250 compared to chemical monocultures, 116. Carotene, for which, the beta carotene for the vitamin A that they are doing, the golden rice or the super banana, 2,919 in an ecological system compared to 745. All you have to do is bring the biodiversity and ecology back into farming. Folic acid, 878 compared to 328. Vitamin C, 24,000 versus 3,000. Calcium, 2,166 compared to 731. Iron, 82 versus 43. Phosphorus, 5,000 versus 300. Magnesium, 1,800 versus 1,400. The nutrition we need will come from ecological farming, and it'll come from biodiversity. We have to intensify the diversity and ecological processes, not toxic chemicals and capital-intensive inputs. So not only do we produce more food and nutrition, the GMO issue, there's comparisons done of corn and non-GM corn. Things we don't need in our food are increasing. Glyphosate residues, glyphosate is not breaking down, which is the story that's told. Glyphosate survives. 13 parts per million, there's 0 in non-GMO. And the mysterious part to which a lot of scientists are turning, formaldehyde is in nature, but it keeps breaking down. So it never accumulates. But in GMO corn, it's accumulating, and there are 200 parts per million compared to 0. Everything that's beneficial has dropped. Calcium is only 14 in GMO corn, 6,000 parts per million in non-GM corn. Magnesium, 2 versus 113. Manganese, which is so vital to brain function, 2 versus 14. So not only are we robbing the soil of nutrients, we are robbing our food system of nutrients. And instead of nutrition, we are putting toxics. And that's a double danger. That's why it's no accident that the health disaster has exploded, whether you look at it in terms of obesity, diabetes, autism, cancers. We haven't even begun to really look. And because in addition to the harm to our bodies, there is a violence against knowledge. There's a violence against society's ability to know. On the one hand, this is the labeling battle, where the right to know is treated as an interference in the freedom of speech of the corporate person. On the other hand, you have the silencing of scientists. And the reason the propagandists are so unhappy with me is because we work with the farmers, we provide alternatives, and we actually have studies that have made a difference to our national policies. 5 states are going organic. We've done a new report, which is called Wealth Per Acre, where we actually take into account all the externalities, and it's 1.26 trillions for Indian farming. And we then do a comparison of chemical farming with farming based on biodiversity, seed sovereignty, food sovereignty. Farmers earn 10 times more when they are free, when they have their own seeds, when they can practice ecological agriculture. An agriculture minister released it. 5 states are making a transition to organic farming, and the northeast of India has a priority. Well, the biotech industry also has a priority for that region. The chemical industry has a priority of that region. So a lot will be decided with what happens there. And finally, there is the violence against freedom and democracy, which in my view is the most serious part of what's going on with the food system. On the one hand, farmers' freedom to save seed is taken away, not just with intellectual property rights laws, but new seed laws that are trying to prevent the alternative that we are sowing from growing. You can't have organic food without organic seed. You can't have non-GMO food without non-GMO seed. And having seen that the alternatives are flourishing everywhere, seed saving is flourishing everywhere, in 2004, an attempt was made to introduce a law that would require all seed to be registered. It's called compulsory registration, which in effect means you prevent farmers from having open source seed. This year in this country, the laws that were framed at the same time, 2004 must have been a very active year, but those 2004 laws are now being implemented. 2 seed libraries have been sent notices, one in Pennsylvania and one in Maryland. In LA, where 2 years ago I asked people start saving seeds, make LA GMO free, they did. Just a few weeks ago, LA became GMO free through a council decision. They're now getting notices that GMOs are seed, and therefore local councils can't make these decisions. That's why the challenge of food is a challenge of food democracy. Even more importantly, it's a challenge of earth democracy, because how we grow our food decides whether we will wipe out species, destroy small farmers, destroy the land, and destroy our health, or through the seeds of freedom and freedom in our food systems, we will protect the earth, we will re-inhabit the countryside, we will have new livelihood and creative opportunities for people, and nourish our health. Local food systems need local seed supply. Local seed supply needs local democracy and sovereignty over the seed. It needs the reclaiming of seed as a commons. This is what I've been doing in India over the last 3 decades. We've created 110 community seed banks which make seeds available after cyclones, during droughts, the nutritious crops that are now producing far more food than industrial agriculture ever can. And I want to close with just 3 short points. The first is, I've already made a request to dear Wendell. We need Wendell to write a poetic piece on seed and life on earth. That these are not human inventions. These are not the properties of Monsanto. And farmers can't be criminalized for performing their duty to the earth to protect the seed and protect the future. And I hope Wendell will do this, because with these new threats coming from the US, India joining, we need a US-India citizens' response, but a citizens' response as earth citizens who live on one common earth and share one common future through a compassionate agriculture, an agriculture based on love and celebration. The second, I think we need to join our campaigns on GMOs, poisons, and pesticides and make them one, to get all poisons out of our food system. They didn't belong there, and they should now be removed. That would be the real peacemaking with the planet and our bodies. So I've been having this idea that Earth Day is now called Mother Earth Day, 22nd of April, and 10th of May is Mother's Day. And we need to really intensify our celebrations of poison-free food, doing everything we can, whether we are council members, whether we are researchers and scientists, whether we are farmers, whether we are eaters, all of us can join. And finally, what the crisis of agriculture and food is reflecting is a crisis in the human condition. A crisis which has made us believe that we can go in ignorance and without power to supermarket shelves as consumers. And that act is eating. That act is not eating. It's not about nourishment. We need to reclaim our earth citizenship with deep consciousness, with deep compassion, so that every time we eat, or every time we sow a seed, we are taking into account the full complex of the web of life that is contained in that seed or contained in that bite of food. And through everyday actions, not wait for 4 years for that vote. We don't have the luxury of waiting 4 years for the next vote. Every meal, every planting, every season, every harvest has to become the sowing of earth democracy, and through it, the sowing of food democracy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.